Pride and Prejudice contains one of the most cherished love stories in English literature. The courtship between Darcy and Elizabeth, surrounded by a much-loved cast of characters in this enchanting story. Today we continue a week-long Hangout on Air series, which sees us explore the world of Jane Austen, from Elizabeth Bennet, Mr. Darcy, film versions to zombie adaptations. I'd like to welcome back Jane Austen Society President and best-selling author of Happily Ever After, celebrating Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice, Susannah Fullerton, and award-winning British actress Miriam Margolyes. Today we'll be talking about the on-screen adaptations of the novel. I would like to welcome Miriam to read from Volume 2, Chapter 6, when Lady Catherine so vehemently interrogates Elizabeth, a scene which has been scripted word for word in many movies and television adaptations to date.
When the ladies returned to the drawing-room, there was little to be done but to hear Lady Catherine talk, which she did without any intermission till coffee came in, delivering her opinion on every subject in so decisive a manner as proved that she was not used to have her judgment controverted. She inquired into Charlotte's domestic concerns familiarly and minutely, and gave her a great deal of advice as to the management of them all, told her how everything ought to be regulated in so small a family as hers, and instructed her as to the care of her cows and her poultry. Elizabeth found that nothing was beneath this great lady's attention, which could furnish her with an occasion of dictating to others. In the intervals of her discourse with Mrs. Collins, she addressed a variety of questions to Maria and Elizabeth, but especially to the latter, of whose connection she knew the least, and who, she observed to Mrs. Collins, was a very genteel, pretty kind of girl. She asked her at different times how many sisters she had, whether they were older or younger than herself, whether any of them were likely to be married, whether they were handsome, where they had been educated, what carriage their father kept, and what had been her mother's maiden name. Elizabeth felt all the impertinence of her questions, but answered them very composedly. Lady Catherine then observed, "Your father's estate is entailed on Mr. Collins, I think, for your sake," turning to Charlotte. "I am glad of it. But otherwise I see no occasion for entailing estates from the female line. It was not thought necessary in Sir Louis de Bourgh's family. Do you play and sing, Miss Bennet?" "A little." "Oh, then some time or other we shall be happy to hear you. Our instrument is a capital one, probably superior to... you shall try it some day. Do your sisters play and sing?" "One of them does." "Why did you not all learn? You ought all to have learned. The Miss Webbs all play, and their father has not so good an income as yours. Do you draw?" "No, not at all." "What? None of you?" "Not one." "That is very strange. But I suppose you have no opportunity. Your mother should have taken you to town every spring for the benefit of masters." "My mother would have had no objection, but my father hates London." "Has your governess left you?" "We never had any governess." "No governess? How is that possible? 5 daughters brought up at home without a governess? I never heard of such a thing. Your mother must have been quite a slave to your education." Elizabeth could hardly help smiling as she assured her that that had not been the case. "Then who taught you? Who attended to you? Without a governess you must have been neglected." Compared with some families, I believe we were, but such of us as wished to learn never wanted the means. We were always encouraged to read, and had all the masters that were necessary. Those who chose to be idle certainly might. "Aye, no doubt, but that is what a governess will prevent. And if I had known your mother, I should have advised her most strenuously to engage one. I always say that nothing is to be done in education without steady and regular instruction, and nobody but a governess can give it. It is wonderful how many families I've been the means of supplying in that way. I'm always glad to get a young person well placed out. 4 nieces of Mrs. Jenkinson are most delightfully situated through my means, and it was but the other day that I recommended another young person who was merely accidentally mentioned to me, and the family are quite delighted with her. Mrs. Collins, did I tell you of Lady Metcalfe's calling yesterday to thank me? She finds Miss Pope a treasure. Lady Catherine, said she, you have given me a treasure. Are any of your younger sisters out, Miss Bennet? Yes, ma'am, all. All? What, all 5 out at once? Very odd. And you were only the second. The younger ones out before the elder are married. Your younger sisters must be very young. Yes, my youngest is not 16. Perhaps she is full young to be much in company, but really, ma'am, I think it would be very hard upon younger sisters that they should not have their share of society and amusement, because the elder may not have means or inclination to marry early. The last-born has as good a right to the pleasures of youth as the first, and to be kept back on such a motive, I think it would not be very likely to promote sisterly affection or delicacy of mind. Upon my word, said her ladyship, you give your opinion very decidedly for so young a person. Pray, what is your age? With 3 younger sisters grown up, replied Elizabeth, smiling, your ladyship can hardly expect me to own it. Lady Catherine seemed quite astonished at not receiving a direct answer, and Elizabeth suspected herself to be the first creature who had ever dared to trifle with so much dignified impertinence. You cannot be more than 20, I'm sure. Therefore, you need not conceal your age. I am not 21. When the gentlemen had joined them and tea was over, the card tables were placed. Lady Catherine, Sir William, and Mr. and Mrs. Collins sat down to quadrille, and as Mr. Berg chose to play at casino, the 2 girls had the honour of assisting Mrs. Jenkinson to make up her party. Their table was superlatively stupid. Scarcely a syllable was uttered that did not relate to the game, except when Mrs. Jenkinson expressed her fears of Mr. Berg's being too hot or too cold, or having too much or too little light. A great deal more passed at the other table. Lady Catherine was generally speaking, stating the mistakes of the 3 others, or relating some anecdote of herself. Mr. Collins was employed in agreeing to everything her ladyship said, thanking her for every fish he won, and apologizing if he thought he won too many. Sir William did not say much. He was storing his memory with anecdotes and noble names. When Lady Catherine and her daughter had played as long as they chose, the tables were broke up. The carriage was offered to Mrs. Collins, gratefully accepted, and immediately ordered. The party then gathered round the fire to hear Lady Catherine determine what weather they were to have on the morrow. From these instructions they were summoned by the arrival of the coach, and with many speeches of thankfulness on Mr. Collins' side, and as many bows on Sir William's, they departed. As soon as they had driven from the door, Elizabeth was called on by her cousin to give her opinion of all that she had seen at Rosings, which, for Charlotte's sake, she made more favourable than it really was. But her commendation, though costing her some trouble, could by no means satisfy Mr. Collins, and he was very soon obliged to take her ladyship's praise into his own hands.
Wonderful. I don't think I've ever seen a better Lady de Burgh played.
Don't you think that Oscar Wilde must have had some memory of that when he wrote the interrogation of when Lady Bracknell interrogates Jack Worthing in The Importance of Being Earnest?
Yes.
Definitely.
Very good point. Mm.
Susannah, I need to clear the elephant from the room before we start. Colin Firth, aka Mr. Darcy, soaked clinging shirt, smouldering at Elizabeth as he tries to retain some dignity as he's sopping wet in his underclothes. It's one of those quintessential on-screen moments for Pride and Prejudice, but amusingly enough doesn't actually happen in the book. What are some of the memorable and best adaptations which have been based on and inspired by Pride and Prejudice?
Just before I answer your query, Letitia, my computer says it's on reserve battery, so I don't know if that's going to be a problem. But what I'd like to do, just before discussing that definitive Colin Firth moment, is to just give everybody a rundown of exactly what movies there have been, what television adaptations, what film versions there have been of Pride and Prejudice. Now, the very first one came out in 1938. It was 60 minutes, it appeared on British television, and of course it was in black and white. That's no longer available, we can't get to see it. In 1940, there was the famous Laurence Olivier Greer Garson movie version with a screenplay by Aldous Huxley, who of course was a very fine writer, but who was rather handicapped in what he was allowed to do within the movie version of the script for that Pride and Prejudice. And that, of course, became a very famous film version. And for many people, it was their first Pride and Prejudice, and they really fell in love with it. Now, in 1949, there was another television version, again, only 60 minutes long. So the novel must have been awfully compressed to fit it into 60 minutes. In 1952, there was another television version. This one was a BBC miniseries, so it was a little bit longer. And interestingly, it had an actor called Peter Cushing in it, and he became much better known as Sherlock Holmes. So Sherlock Holmes as Mr. Darcy gives you a bit of a leap of the imagination there. It's rather hard to picture Sherlock Holmes and Mr. Darcy in the person of the same actor. There was another miniseries in 1958 with an actress called Jane Downs playing Elizabeth and an actor called Alan Badell as Mr. Darcy. And again, this is not available. We can't get to watch these to see what they were like. Then in 1967, there was yet another BBC miniseries, and this was the very first one to be done in colour. So we've moved away from black and white, and there was an actress called Celia Bannerman as Elizabeth, and actually an Australian actor called Louis Fernanda as Mr. Darcy. In 1980, there was the Elizabeth Garvey and David Rintoul, I think it was 5 parts on the BBC, and I love that version. The screenplay was by the famous novelist Fay Weldon, and I think she did a fabulous job. And for me, Elizabeth Garvey is the definitive Elizabeth Bennet. Then in 1995, there was the version that you mentioned, Letitia, the famous Colin Firth, Jennifer Earley version. And on the last night of that, more people sat down in Britain to watch Elizabeth and Darcy get married than the entire population of England at the time that Jane Austen published the novel. So it was phenomenally popular. The videos sold out, the DVDs later sold out. It was, for many people, the defining television version of Pride and Prejudice. Then in 2005, there was another movie version, the one with Keira Knightley and Matthew Macfadyen, and the screenplay again written by a novelist, Deborah Mogach. So that again introduced Pride and Prejudice to a new, younger generation. For some it was very popular, for others it was not popular at all. Now on top of that we have versions in Dutch, in Spanish, in Italian, there's an Israeli version, modernized. There's a Mormon version of Pride and Prejudice in which nobody is allowed to kiss anybody else because the Mormons didn't seem to approve of kissing. And there's also the wonderful Bollywood version, Bride and Prejudice. So those are all the different versions that we have of Pride and Prejudice. Now, obviously, some are infinitely better than others. Some we can't see, so we don't know exactly what they're like. It's left to our imaginations. though I must admit I would really love to see a very young Prunella Scales acting Lydia Bennet, which does happen in one of those earlier versions. I think she might have made a fabulous Lydia Bennet. And I love Prunella Scales as an actor. So to get back to your question about Colin Firth, that defining wet shirt moment is, of course, not in the book, but gosh, it was popular. And thousands of busloads of tourists have travelled to Lyme Park, where it was filmed in Cheshire, to see the pond where Mr. Darcy goes swimming, and in the vain hope that maybe Colin Firth will wander by. So it certainly helped to make the moment, or make the series, incredibly popular. And of course, it is one of the most popular BBC adaptations of any novel of all time. So do the rest of you have favourite versions on film of Pride and Prejudice?
Well,
Jenny?
definitely, I'm afraid I have to go with the 1995 BBC version. I agree with you, though, no wet T-shirt in the actual thing, but I'm not putting it only down to that, although I just think that maybe the smouldering chemistry that's obviously happening between Jennifer Eel and Colin Firth. I gather they had an off-screen romance at the time that was maybe coming through. But no, I liked a lot of the people that they chose to take the parts. The actor, I don't know his name offhand, for Mr. Collins. I like Mr. Bennet. Mrs. Bennet, not so much. But no, I have to say, though, in total package, I like the 1995. The recent, I'll finish up, but the recent film, which is only really about 2 hours long, I just find that that's not long enough in order to develop the book sufficiently, Susannah, or to be able to do that.
It's just too cut, isn't it? Yes. Joanna?
Yes, you never get a feel for Wickham, for example. He just seems like this rather charming but young man, and he's obviously meant to be a bit of a scoundrel, but you never really see it happening. But I like the 1995 one very much. I think Colin Firth, apart from the wet shirt scene, and incidentally, he did not dive into the pool because he was too precious a commodity. And they had an actor do it, but he probably came out, got wet and got out. It was him walking up to Elizabeth. But I do love that version. It has its flaws, but I think he's a very fine actor, and he conveys so well feeling through his face when he's not saying anything. And I think that's part of what makes it for me as Mr. Darcy. I can say I absolutely detest the 2005 version because I think it is a travesty of the novel, quite apart from not being long enough. Oddly, I think the 1940 version, which completely distorts everything, they wear crinolines, Greer Garson's 35. The whole thing is Lady Catherine's turns into be a fairy godmother. It's all wrong, and yet in a way it's much truer to the spirit of the book than that 2005 version, which in attempting to modernise it, it just goes completely, I think, off the radar. I think Keira Knightley's all wrong. Poor old Matthew McFadden looks completely lost most of the time. And the girls just giggle, pigs in the house, the mud. Keira Knightley, I think, is just terrible as Elizabeth. She's so modern. Every mannerism is modern. And I don't think she's a wonderful actress. She doesn't manage to convey, as Colin Firth does, anything that she's feeling. It's all grimaces and grins. And there are many things about that film that completely distorted, I think, the book. And one that really struck me was when she looks at the portrait of Darcy, and it isn't a portrait, it's the marble bust in the Hall of Sculptures, and she looked at it. And the point of the book is that she's in the book, the scene in the book and in the 1995 version, she's looking up at Darcy and then imagining the real man, and it's a very warm moment. There's a smile on his face. A marble bust is so cold, and I think that's the whole movie. In a second, you see what's wrong with it. So okay, I'll stop.
Letitia.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think one of the main problems that we're all touching on is that how can you make this a movie in just 2 hours? Like, it is such an incredible piece of literature, and there's so many wonderful scenes and pieces of interactions and conversations, and when you have to try and narrow it down to these 2 hours, it is a travesty. You lose so much.
One of the other big problems I had with 2005, sorry we're bagging it so much, but was actually the relationship between Mr. and Mrs. Bennet. Mr. Bennet, especially towards the end, he almost seemed to be in tune with her. Did other people feel that? That seemed very out of kilter.
Yeah. Lying on the bed together and chatting.
Exactly.
Having a cuddle. There's an extraordinary moment in the 1940 film version, and I think this is how, from memory, this is how the movie ends, when Mrs. Bennet is looking delighted at getting some of her daughters married off. Mr. Bennet says to her, "Well, my dear, perhaps it's a good thing we didn't drown any of them at birth." So they do very strange things with the scripts that these characters have to work with. Miriam, have you got a favourite version?
No, I haven't, because I don't like adaptations of great novels. I find that the screen diminishes everything it touches. Yeah. It's very, very rare to have, as for example in Great Expectations, the original one that I know, which is the David Lean one, the David Lean adaptation. That was a fine piece of work. But for the most part, they don't get it. And the language of Jane Austen and the subtlety, the wit, the cool quality is just not cinematic. And I don't feel that any of them are any good. The actors that you liked, Susannah, Elizabeth Garvey and David Rintoul, I did think that was probably the nearest to it. But I'm not interested in any of the others, to be frank.
Capturing irony is something that's terribly hard to do on screen, and I think this is the real problem that any director has with a Jane Austen novel. And perhaps in some ways one of the very best ones is Clueless, which is a modern adaptation of Emma, and which I think does manage to capture some of the irony. But I'm like you, Miriam. I feel that it's the book that's the great work of art. Film versions come and go. People enjoy them. Visually, they're lovely. You see all the beautiful costumes and the carriages and the horses and the English country houses that are so gorgeous. But to capture the essence of the book is almost impossible on film. And people often say to me, as president of the society, "Oh, you must sit and watch the movies all the time. You must love them." And I say, no, years go by and I never look at them. It's the novel that I go back to again and again and again.
One of the problems about acting period stuff is that younger actors really don't know how to speak anymore. They don't enunciate, they have no diction, they have no clarity, their words are slurred, and you cannot give the impression of the world of class without having the right voice. It just doesn't work. And
Miriam,
I find most people's speech very sloppy.
Is that because drama schools are not teaching diction anymore, or is that because they're just not getting it at school before they even get to drama school?
I don't really know the answer to it, but I think it is widespread that young people feel it is not PC to have a posh voice. Now, the thing is, you can have a posh voice or not, but you must be able to do one. And they're not able to do it. It's no good, if you can't show who is upper class and who isn't. It's just impossible to do that in a sloppy way. you know? I mean, it's character.
Jenny, I think you wanted to make a point.
I was going to say, linking a little bit with what Miriam's saying, the age of the actors that are chosen in the various film versions, I am accepting what Miriam's saying. Going back to the Greer Garson and Laurence Olivier version, I adore Sir Laurence Olivier and Greer Garson as well. I think they're just wonderful. But they were, well, Greer Garson was just too old. She was obviously had a lot of, you know, sort of a tremendous record and was well loved, but just too old. And actually, with the 1995 version, probably Jennifer Eel and Colin Firth are a wee bit old when you say that she's not 1 and 20, 21 that Miriam read out. So maybe with linking in with Miriam, they've got to have age and experience to play the parts. But then does it always fit in? Mr. Bennet are generally very old, but they'd only be in their 40s. And I think Colin Firth was probably nearly 40 when he played Mr. Darcy.
35.
Mrs. Bennet is really only in her early 40s. Mrs. Bennet is probably about, you know, 43, 44. And Lady Catherine de Bourgh also has a daughter in her 20s. She's probably only about 50. But so often in film versions, they have an actress playing Lady Catherine who looks about late 60s or even 70s. Of course, Judi Dench did her in the recent film version, and Judi Dench is a fabulous actor, but she was probably too old for the part of Lady Catherine.
How much do you think the film versions hurt the book when people go and feel like, oh, I want to read the novel now, and then find that there's just no, you know, parallel to what they saw on screen to what they're reading in the novel?
Well, I think the big plus of the film versions is if there's a very popular film, it brings younger people to reading the books. And so many young people these days won't touch a classic novel. It seems to be something old-fashioned and too long and too wordy. So if a popular adaptation of Pride and Prejudice brings young people to reading the book, I think that's fantastic. Some might be disappointed because there's no wet shirt scene or it's not exactly like the movie, but others, of course, will discover what a wonderful novel it is. And so if film versions can bring readers to the books, then I think they have done something really worthwhile. But as I said earlier, it's the books that have lasted for 200 years and will continue to last. Film versions will come and go.
One thing I think film versions help with is giving a voice, because you often find with these wonderful classic novels that people don't know how to read them, and they can't, you know, read what the characters are saying in that voice. And so I think it helps them when they go from film to novel for the first time, reading these classics, you know, how to personify these words in their head.
The very best way to experience the book is to get an audio version read by a great actor like Miriam and listen to it as you're cooking or you're driving your car. An unabridged version, of course, you should never listen to an abridged version of Pride and Prejudice, but that's a fantastic way of listening to experiencing an Austen novel. And then the voices come alive, and just like us listening to Miriam before, you get the different voices for the different characters, you get the humour, the irony. That's a fantastic way for any young person to experience Pride and Prejudice.
Fantastic. Well, once again, we've, this week we've been really delving into all the topics, haven't we? And you're right, Susannah, I don't think anything will compare to the novel in terms of, you know, long-lasting impression that it has made in your life once you pick it up and read it. I don't think any film adaptation has that same effect. But tomorrow we'll be sort of continuing this topic a little bit by looking at how the novel has had its life after the last chapter, and the crazy adaptations that have happened, from zombie adaptations, pornography, sequel upon sequel upon sequel. I read somewhere today that someone said it's as if every young woman who reads Austen feels like she needs to sit down and write a sequel to it. I think it's a bit much, but I can see his point. That's going to be a great discussion. And we'll also have singer Lizzyspit with us, who has written a lovely song that was inspired by Elizabeth and Mr. Darcy's wedding. So thank you so much, everybody, for being here today, and thank you for everybody who's been watching. And we'll see you all tomorrow for another wonderful chat about the incredible Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.